and this is a bit I get really excited about, because we talk about this when I feel like we talk about this whenever I might see you.
Yes.
We love what we do. What can we say though?
Welcome to this earthday.org 22 minutes interview for Earth Week 2024. I am Maxine Bedat, and I'm the director of the New Standard Institute. And today I'm here with Samata Pattinson. Hi, Samata.
Hi, Maxine. Hi, everybody. My name is Samata Pattinson. I am CEO and founder of Black Pearl, a cultural sustainability organization.
So, Samata, you are an educator, writer, cultural sustainability pioneer, and recently the CEO of sustainable organization Red Carpet Green Dress that delivered sustainable fashion paraded by movie stars at the Oscars each year. But in March, you walked the red carpet at the 95th Academy Awards yourself, having written the Sustainable Style Guide for the Oscars. Now you're an entrepreneur with the launch of your new cultural sustainability organization, Black Pearl. Can you tell us briefly what got you into fashion and sustainability in the first place?
Of course. So I got into fashion from a very, very young age, being in a British-born Ghanian family, being surrounded by fashion and really just clothes. At the time, I didn't apply the word fashion to it at all, as an expression of cultural identity. I have two incredibly stylish and empowering sisters, a mum who really did keep her connection to Ghana whilst being in the UK through the clothes that she wore, and sometimes the clothes that she made my sisters and I. So for me, the relationship with clothing was personal. It was a sense of identity. And as I grew and learned more about the fashion industry, I started to recognize that there was a space in the industry where people and planet was more of a consideration than purely the aesthetic impact of what something looks like. And so that was kind of just the beginning of my curiosity around what is sustainable fashion, how does sustainability and fashion intersect, and how does that relate to me and my community and the things that I'm interested in. So that was kind of how I began.
Interesting. I also have two sisters. Very fashionable.
Are you the middle one? Are you kind of, where do you sit in the hierarchy?
Oh, Samata, I'm now offended. No offense to any middle children out there, but I'm the youngest.
I'm a middle child.
Okay. Well, then no offense to you, Samata.
It's all good. I'm taken.
I'm married to a middle child. It's all great. Okay. So why is culture important, in your opinion, when it comes to sustainability? I know you spoke a little bit about that, but would love if you could dive a bit deeper.
I think culture is important because through culture, we start to have like almost a tool and a mechanism to explore.
So what is an area you are working in that might surprise people?
So one of the areas that we're working in that might surprise people is storytelling. And the reason that we decided to kind of participate in that realm is because obviously touching film and media and so on, we could see the power of storytelling. And I just started to really not realize, but just let it hit home how much of a powerful role the media plays in informing and shaping perspectives of sustainability. If your only perspective of sustainability is the representation of someone, say in fashion, going and buying a coveted luxury piece and holding on to that for a long time and looking after it well, you aren't seeing representations of sustainability that are everything we talked about, from rural communities mending to communities doing hand-me-downs and sharing their resources across the community. You aren't seeing those stories being told, and I think even more dangerously, you have this narrative of rich and poor, this idea that poor sustainability or impoverished sustainability looks a certain way, and wealthy sustainability looks another way. Wealthy sustainability is like accessing Whole Foods, and poor sustainability is like mending a hole in an item that's torn. And it's so much more nuanced than that, because to me, the sustainability that's reflected with maybe a lower access to capital and financial resource is sometimes very wealthy in a knowledge about the history of a garment, a knowledge about the history of how something was made, an ability to make something a legacy or heirloom technique that's been passed down. And we're talking about fashion now. You can say the same thing about music, and film, which are all industries that interpret culture and then find a way to essentially storytell it, commercialize it, commodify it, and feed it back to people so that they can feel like they're part of the cultural movement or moment of the time. And we see that with the trends in movies, we see with what films are capturing, we see that with like what music is capturing, even recent albums, like how Beyonce's album has started a whole conversation about culture, cowboys, and the African-American contribution to that conversation. So I think these are really, really great modes to have the conversations because they also hit people in a place where they feel something.
Yep.
People have an emotional reaction to fashion, to film, to music. And if we can get the emotional alchemy of what someone feels and combine that with a perspective that they've lived or can understand, then we start to be able to shift the way people think and see sustainability. Because, and I don't know if you probably can see this as well with your work, but right now there's definitely a disconnect with the conversation. You know, if I say to somebody I work in sustainability, like they immediately have a perception of what my conversation is going to bring. Have you had the same thing?
Absolutely. Yeah. And who I am and all sorts of things.
Yeah, here you are, like you're not, what you're wearing. They'll say things like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm eating meat," or "I'm sorry."
I get that all the time. Like, I am actually not vegetarian. Go ahead.
Right. So it comes with all these things. So suddenly, if we can start looking at things like, and I always use the example of geography and that because I think it's an easy one. If we can start pushing out and say, okay, well, in Japan or in Ghana, how is this a practice that you've done inherently or that you've done without the fanfare, without the language? How is your culture just part of that way of living? Like in Ghana, we always joke, the plastic bag is a shower cap. It's what you bring the thing in. It's tied for multiple uses. Yep. And even though we won't say circularity, that's what it is, right? That's why we see culture as a gateway, because it helps us to address like the power dynamics of things like geography. One of the things I know we'll talk about is the Fashion Act and everything around that. And I think it's so powerful because it gives us a chance to explore how something like a legislation coming from a global north country is able to encompass and address grievances across a global south perspective. And that also tells us something about the balance of power, the importance of using these power dynamics culturally for good and not for exploitation. And that's all conversations rooted in culture and the different expressions of it. As a proud Fashion Act ambassador, and I truly am, you're just doing such great work. For real. I wanted to ask you a few questions as well, Maxine. Would that be okay?
Let's do it.
Okay, let's do it. So my first question for you is, so Maxine, you started out by founding your successful sustainable fashion brand, Zadie. But after 4 years, you decided to close that business and start the New Standard Institute, which is a think tank dedicated to bringing the latest independent science-backed analysis of sustainability claims and the stories of the people on the ground to drive fashion to be a force for good. So what was it that made you move away from having a kind of popular and successful clothing brand to founding a think tank?
Yeah, so in the journey of Zadie, there were a few kind of moments that happened that sparked the impetus to turn into a slightly different direction. One is, my interest in starting the fashion company to begin with, like I'm a lawyer by background. I'd worked both in the big law, but also in the UN system. So I was always interested in like the system of fashion, like not necessarily the fashion of fashion. And so I thought initially that through a new, and this was back in 2012, so different time, but that with business you could, showcase a story and get people to be more connected to their products. And that would be like how the system could change. What I realized in like doing all of that was like we could put a lot of effort into this company, but at the same time, like nothing was stopping the fast fashion. Like it wasn't enough to like outweigh. Like I always think of like zooming out on the earth and like looking at it from above and like, are we making a net impact? Like, is it net moving in the right direction? And like we were working in this like very niche little space, but meanwhile, like thoughtless fashion was like very much taking off. And so that was kind of one thing. And then the other is like we would put out at the company level just information that we were coming across about the industry, and media would reach out to us, and other brands would reach out to us and like, oh, like, can you tell us more about this? This is like so interesting and helpful. And it became very clear that like so much of sustainability up until that point in this space are the impacts of the industry, I should say more accurately, like were being narrated through brand who had a very different business objective than like just the truth. So that's even why we call it like sustainable fashion. There's no such thing as sustainable fashion. There's an industry that has impact, and there are different companies working on reducing that impact in various different ways. So even like that narrative was like through the narration of brand. So it became clear that like more independent information was needed out there, especially back at that time. And then I remember like I did this TEDx talk, and some anonymous commenter was like, "You're just giving me this whole thing to get me to buy your Zadie sweater." And I was like, if only you knew that I've created the sweater so that you understand the whole story. And so then it was just like, okay, we need, like, if we could just focus on getting that information out. So that was why the turn, as my theory of change kind of evolved from like, it's going to be from a company to it's going to be from getting more people to understand to learn the impacts that I was learning of the industry. And then finally to the theory of change today, which is like, oh wait, we need law.
Yeah. Through the work you're doing, I feel like you're pushing not only for the solution towards like these really systemic problems, but you're also creating a space for other conversations to take place. And so that's why I just feel like what the Fashion Act is representing is such a big part of what we're all striving towards.
So the Fashion Act, you know, what it does is it's a New York State bill. It's a state piece of legislation, but it has global repercussions because it impacts any company with global revenue over $100 million that is selling into the state and requires that they address the issues in their supply chain, which are global. And so that's why it's using state law to have real global impacts. And it requires that the companies reduce their carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, so in line with planetary boundaries. It requires that they work with their textile mills to address the chemical issues in their supply chain. And it requires that garment workers actually receive their due wages, which is not the case, not the average case in this industry. And there's real enforcement teeth behind it. So a company can be fined up to 2% of global revenue for infringement. You could have a really strong law, but if it's not enforced in a meaningful way, then a company could just be like, well, we're going to continue what we're doing. And like, if we get fined, we'll just like pay the little fine. 2% is not like a little fine. 2% is when the C-suite actually is like, oh, wait, we need to actually care about our sustainability team.
I love that figure.
There shouldn't be a world like we are in today where the brand doesn't know what their supply chain is. Yeah. So that's the preliminary component of it. But then there is the actual working with those suppliers to reduce the impact. So to reduce carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, to partner with the major suppliers on chemical management so that there aren't toxic chemicals left in the garment, and there are not toxic chemicals that are being put in the effluents in the local waterways. And then to work, the term of art is purchasing practices. So like, what are the brand's terms vis-a-vis their suppliers so that the suppliers can actually afford to pay the garment workers their legal wages? So that's and then that there is true enforcement through the Attorney General, who can have a serious fine if a company is not actually following the law.
Yeah, incredible. It's so thorough. And one of the reasons I actually kind of wanted to be part of it, especially from a Black Pearl perspective of just culture and making sure we're doing representative work and representative storytelling, is, to me, this is a continuation of efforts. And I think if we can see it that way, then we're seeing what's happened historically, culturally around the world that's fed into us being able to even identify these kinds of grievances as existing, So I was thinking about just examining how communities across different cultures have come together to defend or protect the environment, to advocate for the rights of the workers within their ecosystems. And this goes back to like Gandhi's Khadi movement, which was all around hand woven cloth and like hand spun, and trying to, essentially use that as a symbol of resistance and protecting what was native and indigenous to the community. I thought about the Brazilian landless movement and workers' movement as well, which was, again, not specifically about the fashion industry per se, but it was about advocating for the rights of rural workers in Brazil, and even across to South Africa and the Textile and Garment Workers Union, and how a big part of that was for pushing for the rights of textile and garment workers during the apartheid and after it as well, so post-apartheid. And then, the Pacific Islanders and everything that they've been pushing for around climate change and advocating for action on that. So when we think about this act, to me, it fits into this very beautiful puzzle of all of these different movements happening across the globe that are all kind of pushing for the same thing. And a lot of what these things have uncovered have fed into the knowledge that you are using to be able to say, we can identify where these things are happening, and that's why I think it's so important, because it's a patchwork of efforts. It's fair trade conversations that talk about this. It's the preservation of traditional techniques that push for this. And then we have this act that's coming out of a very powerful state that actually has the power to use its power for good, Yep. So it's just a great part of a continued global conversation to me. And that was one of the main reasons I wanted to be an ambassador for it, because I recognize that we're a sum of our parts, and that it's an all boats rise mentality that we have to have. And you're almost baton passing for all of these other movements around the world that have been pushing in their own ways, for impact.
It's a blueprint, in some respects, for a just transition of one industry.
Yeah.
Hopefully when we get everybody joining in, we can get it passed, and we can envision things to be better. Like it, I think there's so much exciting cultural work that you've really been focused on like, what does the future, like what can a great future look like? And the other thing to know is that New York is only in session, the legislature is only in session between January and June. So what that means is laws are only passed in those times, and then they are not, they're out of session between June and then the end of December. Yeah. So we have between now and June to get this bill passed for this session. There's a lot of interest in the bill. There are over 86 co-sponsors. That's a really significant amount. But we need to make a lot of noise, and all of us have to participate, not just people who think of themselves as advocates, because that's the amount of noise we make is drives whether the legislature will actually pay attention to the bill.
Well, I have my hopes that the Fashion Act will pass, and I urge anyone in New York State to write to their representatives in Albany and urge them to vote for this bill. For everyone listening, you can go to thefashionact.org to find out more.
And if you want to know more about Samata's amazing new venture, Black Pearl, you can go to withblackpearl.com. And last but not least, thanks to earthday.org for having us today, and happy Earth Day 2024 to everyone.
Yes, thank you. Happy Earth Day 2024 to everyone.